Forget Australia's modern venomous snakes and spiders. That's child's play compared to what actually lived here 45,000 years ago. A marsupial predator with a bite force stronger, relative to its size, than an actual lion's. A lizard nearly 8 meters long. A crocodile that ran on land on legs that had evolved something close to hooves. This is not a horror movie screenwriter's invention. This is real, documented, paleontologically confirmed Ice Age Australia. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel. Your support genuinely helps us keep making films like this one. Thank you. Now, to understand why prehistoric Australia produced a lineup of animals this genuinely strange, we need to start with the continent itself, because the monsters this film is about to introduce were never an accident. They were the direct, predictable result of tens of millions of years spent almost entirely alone. Australia began drifting away from the other southern continents roughly 85 million years ago, as the ancient supercontinent Gondwana broke apart piece by piece. By around 35 million years ago, the final connection, a land bridge linking Australia to Antarctica, had fully severed, and the continent entered a period of near total isolation that would last essentially uninterrupted until humans finally arrived by boat sometime around 65,000 years ago. For context, that is a span of isolation roughly 7 times longer than the entire history of anatomically modern humans as a species. It is worth slowing down on exactly how Australia's isolation actually unfolded, because the process was considerably more gradual and considerably more consequential than a single clean break implies. When Australia first began separating from Antarctica, roughly 85 million years ago, the continent that eventually drifted north bore almost no resemblance to the arid landscape most people associate with it today. Fossil evidence recovered from across the continent, including well-preserved plant material and even fossilized freshwater fish, confirms that early Australia was covered predominantly in cool, temperate rainforest, considerably wetter and considerably more heavily forested than anything found there now. For tens of millions of years, as the continent slowly drifted northward at a rate of roughly 7 centimeters per year, barely faster than a human fingernail grows, this rainforest ecosystem persisted largely intact, sheltering an early fauna already beginning to diverge from its relatives on the other fragmenting pieces of Gondwana. The transformation into the drier, more open landscape associated with Australia's eventual megafauna occurred gradually, driven by 2 compounding forces operating across tens of millions of years. The first was simple geography. As Australia drifted steadily northward, it moved out from beneath the reliable rainfall patterns of higher southern latitudes and into a subtropical high-pressure belt considerably less generous with consistent precipitation. The second was global climate change operating on an even larger scale, as Earth's overall climate cooled gradually across the Cenozoic era, driven substantially by the growth of Antarctic ice sheets following Australia and South America's final separation from that continent. A global cooling trend that reduced atmospheric moisture and further dried out continental interiors worldwide, Australia included. By approximately 15 million years ago, This combination of drift and global cooling had produced a landscape increasingly dominated by open woodland and grassland rather than closed canopy rainforest. And the animals inhabiting this changing continent evolved accordingly. Herbivores that had once browsed on soft rainforest vegetation gradually gave way to lineages better adapted to tougher, more fibrous grasses and shrubs, animals requiring more specialized teeth, more efficient digestive systems, and, in several documented lineages including the ancestors of Diprotodon, dramatically increased body size. A common evolutionary response among grazing herbivores, adapting to open landscapes where safety in numbers and sheer physical bulk offer more reliable protection than the dense cover a forest environment provides. This deep environmental history matters directly for understanding the animals this film has already introduced, because every one of them represents the end product of tens of millions of years of continuous adaptation to a continent that never stopped becoming drier, more open, and more physically demanding. The megafauna of Pleistocene Australia were not simply large by coincidence. They were large because an entire continent had spent an almost incomprehensible span of deep time slowly transforming beneath them. And size, on a landscape offering steadily less shelter and steadily less reliable food, had become one of the most consistently successful survival strategies available. This isolation mattered enormously because evolution does not work from a single shared playbook. It works with whatever raw biological material happens to be available on a given landmass, shaped by whatever specific pressures that landmass happens to apply. On most continents, placental mammals, the group that includes nearly everything familiar to a modern audience, from lions and wolves to elephants and horses, came to dominate the large animal niches through competitive advantages tied to reproduction and metabolic efficiency. Australia, isolated before this global takeover was complete, took a different path almost entirely. Marsupials, mammals that give birth to extremely underdeveloped young and complete the bulk of development in an external pouch, filled nearly every ecological role a continent needs filled. The grazers, the browsers, and, most relevant to this film, the apex predators. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains why so much of what follows will feel simultaneously familiar and deeply wrong. Convergent evolution, the tendency for unrelated lineages facing similar pressures to arrive at similar solutions, meant that Australia's marsupial carnivores frequently ended up resembling cats, dogs, or bears in general silhouette. But underneath that familiar silhouette sat a genuinely different biological engine, with different growth patterns, different reproductive strategies, and, as we are about to see, different upper limits on just how much raw mechanical force a predator's jaw could ultimately generate. Let's begin with the animal whose sheer scale set the stage for everything else on this continent: Diprotodon optatum. Diprotodon was, and remains, the largest marsupial ever documented in the fossil record. A genuinely massive herbivore, standing roughly 1.78 meters, about 5 feet 10 inches, at the shoulder and stretching up to 3 meters, nearly 10 feet in length, with some estimated body masses reaching close to 2,800 kilograms, over 6,000 pounds, comparable to a small car. Superficially, its build resembled an enormous, thick-set wombat, which is fitting since genetic and anatomical analysis confirms Diprotodon's closest living relatives are indeed the wombat and the koala, animals whose modern descendants rarely exceed 40 kilograms. Diprotodon roamed across most of the Australian continent for roughly 1.6 million years, grazing on the tough, low-nutrient vegetation of an increasingly arid landscape. Its sheer bulk offered a fairly reliable form of protection against most threats. But size alone, on this particular continent, was never quite enough to guarantee safety, because Australia had already begun assembling something specifically capable of bringing an animal this size down. There is one specific site that deserves direct attention before this film moves further, because it offers something genuinely rare in paleontology. Not a scattered handful of isolated bones, but an entire, densely packed graveyard, preserving the final moments of dozens of animals within a single, remarkably narrow window of time. Lake Callabonna, a dry salt lake in the remote northeastern corner of South Australia, sits within one of the driest, least hospitable regions on the entire continent. During the Pleistocene, however, this same location held a genuine, if increasingly unreliable, body of water, and the specific geology of the lakebed itself. A fine, sticky clay that could trap and hold a heavy animal in place, transformed this site into something close to a natural catastrophe, recorded directly in stone. As the surrounding region grew progressively drier, animals converging on the lake in a desperate search for the last remaining surface water repeatedly became mired in the soft, waterlogged clay at its margins, unable to free themselves, eventually dying exactly where they became trapped. The result, discovered and first excavated in the 1890s, is one of the richest concentrations of Diprotodon remains found anywhere in Australia, alongside dozens of Guineornis skeletons, in some cases with 3 or more nearly complete individual birds recovered from a single small excavated area barely larger than a modest room. The specific preservation conditions at Callabonna, the fine clay sealing each carcass away from scavengers and rapid decomposition alike, proved so effective that several specimens retain genuinely rare soft tissue detail. Preserved skin impressions, hair, and even the texture of foot pads, details that almost never survive in ordinary fossilization processes, which typically preserve only bone. Perhaps the single most evocative piece of physical evidence recovered from this site is not a skeleton at all, but a trackway, a continuous sequence of Diprotodon footprints preserved directly in the ancient lakebed surface, tracing the animal's final faltering steps as it moved across ground already beginning to fail beneath its own weight. Walking that same trackway today, a visitor can trace, footprint by footprint, the exact final path taken by an individual animal tens of thousands of years ago, a level of direct physical connection to a specific extinct individual's actual final moments that few fossil sites anywhere in the world can genuinely offer. Callabonna's broader significance extends beyond its impressive concentration of specimens. It offers direct, physical, difficult to dispute evidence of exactly the kind of climatic stress this film has already discussed. In the abstract, a landscape drying out beneath the animals still attempting to survive within it. Water sources becoming fewer, more distant, and more dangerous to reach, until the search for water itself became a lethal trap in its own right. Whatever additional role human hunting pressure ultimately played in the broader continental extinction pattern, Lake Callabonna preserves direct physical testimony that Australia's drying climate alone was already exacting a genuine, measurable toll on this continent's largest animals. That something was Thylacoleo carnifex. And if you take away exactly one fact from this entire film, it should probably be this one. Thylacoleo, commonly known as the marsupial lion, was not physically enormous by predator standards. A typical adult weighed somewhere in the range of 100 to 160 kilograms, roughly 220 to 350 pounds, comparable to a large leopard or a small lion. What made Thylacoleo genuinely extraordinary was not its size, it was its bite. In 2005, a team of researchers led by Wroe published a detailed biomechanical analysis in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, calculating something called bite force quotient, a measurement that adjusts raw bite force for an animal's body size, allowing meaningful comparison between predators of very different scales. Their finding, replicated and cited extensively in the 2 decades since, was genuinely startling. A Thylacoleo specimen weighing approximately 109 kilograms produced a bite force quotient of 194. A modern African lion, weighing nearly 3 times as much at roughly 295 kilograms, produced a bite force quotient of only 112. A tiger came in even lower, at 127. Translate that out of the technical language for a moment. Pound for pound, kilogram for kilogram. Thylacoleo carnifex bit down with more relative force than a modern lion, more than a modern tiger, and more than almost any other confirmed mammalian carnivore, living or extinct, ever measured using this methodology. An animal roughly the size of a leopard was applying bite pressure that, scaled up to lion size, would have been genuinely unprecedented. How does a predator this size generate that kind of mechanical force? The answer lies partly in its skull architecture. Unlike cats, whose primary killing tools are their elongated canine teeth, Thylacoleo's canines were reduced, almost vestigial. In their place, the front incisors had enlarged dramatically into forward-projecting stabbing structures, while the third premolars, a tooth position most mammals use for relatively unremarkable chewing, had transformed into enormous blade-like shearing edges, essentially a built-in pair of scissors running along each side of the jaw. This unusual dental arrangement, combined with an exceptionally short, deep skull and correspondingly massive jaw-closing muscles, allowed Thylacoleo to convert its entire skull into an efficient force-multiplying machine, compensating for its comparatively modest overall size with raw mechanical leverage most other predators simply could not match. And Thylacoleo carried one more specialized tool most people never expect from anything resembling a large cat. A genuinely enormous semi-retractable claw on each first digit, or thumb, positioned on both front paws. This claw, considerably larger and more robust than anything found on its remaining 4 digits, appears to have functioned less like a typical predatory claw used for gripping prey during a chase, and more like a dedicated disemboweling tool, potentially deployed after an initial bite had already immobilized a target, allowing Thylacoleo to open large body cavities with brutal efficiency. For decades, everything just described remained largely theoretical, reconstructed from skeletal anatomy and comparative biomechanics rather than direct behavioral evidence. That changed in 2016 when researchers examining a cave system in southwestern Australia published findings in the journal Scientific Reports, documenting something genuinely rare in paleontology: actual physical claw marks, preserved directly on the cave walls, matching the specific size, shape, and spacing expected from Thylacoleo's distinctive semi-retractable claws. This was not a reconstruction. This was not an inference drawn from tooth wear or isotope analysis. This was a direct physical trace of the animal's actual behavior, preserved in stone, confirming that Thylacoleo used these caves, very likely as denning sites, potentially for raising young in a protected environment, exactly as its anatomy had long suggested it might. Thylacoleo carnifex, genuinely remarkable as it was, represents only the final and largest member of a considerably longer evolutionary story. And understanding that broader family history reveals something worth pausing on. This lineage had been quietly refining the same basic predatory toolkit for millions of years before carnifex ever appeared. The family Thylacoleonidae first appears in the Australian fossil record roughly 24 million years ago, during the Oligocene epoch, with early species considerably smaller than the eventual apex predator this film has already introduced. The earliest confirmed member of this lineage, a genus called Microleo, weighed an estimated 600 grams, comparable to a small house cat, and almost certainly occupied a modest ecological niche, likely preying on insects, small reptiles, and other similarly sized animals within the still forested landscape of its era. Even at this early diminutive stage, however, the family's characteristic dental specializations were already beginning to appear. Reduced canines, enlarging incisors, and the first signs of the distinctive shearing premolar that would eventually become this lineage's signature weapon. Across the following 20 million years, as Australia's climate continued drying and its landscape continued opening into the grassland and woodland environments already discussed, successive Thylacoleonid species grew steadily larger, tracking the same broader continental trend toward increased body size already observed in herbivores like the ancestors of Diprotodon. A mid-sized genus called Wacaleo, weighing somewhere between 20 and 41 kilograms depending on the specific species, appears in the fossil record beginning around 18 million years ago, representing a clear intermediate stage between the cat-sized Microleo and the considerably larger carnifex that would eventually follow. By the time Thylacoleo carnifex itself appears in the fossil record, sometime around 2 million years ago, This lineage had been refining essentially the same basic anatomical solution: reduced canines, enlarged shearing premolars, and a specialized retractable thumb claw for over 20 million years of continuous, incremental adaptation. This deep lineage history matters for understanding exactly what carnifex actually represents. It was not evolution's first attempt at building a marsupial predator capable of tackling genuinely large prey. It was the final, most refined product of a slow-motion engineering project, spanning roughly 22 million years. Each successive generation testing and incrementally improving upon a body plan that had already proven itself effective at smaller scales, long before the largest and most capable version of that design finally emerged to face down animals the size of Diprotodon. It is worth noting, too, that Thylacoleo carnifex was not the only large predator this specific family ever produced, nor was it necessarily competing alone. Fossil evidence suggests that at various points across the Pleistocene, multiple thylacoleonid species, along with other predators including large varanid lizards and terrestrial crocodiles like quincana, occupied overlapping territories, suggesting a genuinely competitive predator guild rather than any single dominant hunter enjoying uncontested access to the continent's abundant, well-defended herbivores. The specific biomechanical solution Thylacoleo evolved becomes considerably more interesting when placed alongside a very different, more famous predatory design that evolved entirely independently on the other side of the planet, facing a broadly similar problem. How does a mammalian predator take down prey substantially larger than itself? Saber-toothed cats, including the well-known Smilodon of Ice Age North and South America, solved this problem through dramatically elongated upper canine teeth, delivered via a wide gape and a powerful downward stabbing motion, typically targeting the throat or abdomen of large prey in a single devastating strike rather than a prolonged wrestling-style takedown. This strategy required an unusually wide jaw opening, a comparatively weaker overall bite force relative to body size than might be expected, and, critically, prey that could be reliably immobilized or restrained by the predator's powerful forelimbs before the canines were deployed, since the elongated teeth themselves were surprisingly vulnerable to breakage under lateral stress. Thylacoleo, facing a broadly comparable ecological challenge on an entirely separate continent, arrived at a genuinely different engineering solution. Rather than elongating a single pair of stabbing teeth, Thylacoleo's lineage instead concentrated its evolutionary investment into maximizing raw shearing force across an enlarged premolar blade, paired with a short, mechanically efficient jaw capable of generating exceptional bite pressure at a comparatively narrow gape. Where Smilodon essentially specialized in a single explosive strike, Thylacoleo specialized in overwhelming, repeated shearing force. An approach current biomechanical modeling suggests would have been particularly effective for opening the tough hide of a genuinely massive animal like Diprotodon, where a single stabbing wound might prove considerably less immediately effective than a sustained, powerful shearing bite capable of causing catastrophic blood loss quickly. This comparison illustrates something genuinely important about how evolution solves recurring problems. Confronted with essentially the same underlying challenge, taking down prey many times a predator's own body weight. Two entirely unrelated mammalian lineages, separated by an ocean, a different reproductive strategy, and tens of millions of years of independent evolutionary history, arrived at two completely different anatomical solutions, each one internally consistent, each one genuinely effective within its own specific ecological context. Smilodon's canines and Thylacoleo's shearing premolars represent, in a very real sense, two separate answers to the same exam question, graded not by any external authority, but by the simple, unforgiving test of whether the animal carrying them successfully reproduced. Researchers studying Thylacoleo's skull have additionally noted that its jaw-closing musculature, reconstructed from muscle attachment scarring preserved on fossil skulls, appears disproportionately large relative to comparable placental carnivores of similar overall body size. A difference some researchers connect to broader differences in marsupial neurological and muscular development compared to placental mammals. Whatever the precise underlying cause, the practical result remains the same. An animal that, skull for skull, converted more of its available cranial architecture directly into raw biting force than nearly any other mammalian predator, living or extinct, that scientists have ever been able to measure. The 2016 discovery of preserved Thylacoleo claw marks deserves a fuller account in its own right, because the specific circumstances surrounding it illustrate exactly how rare and exactly how valuable direct behavioral evidence like this actually is within the broader field of paleontology. The research, led by Samuel Arman and Gavin Prideaux of Flinders University and published in the journal Scientific Reports, focused on a network of limestone caves in the Nullarbor region of southern Australia, an area already well known among paleontologists for its exceptional fossil preservation. Owing to the region's extremely dry climate and stable underground conditions. Deep within one specific cave system, far beyond the reach of any natural daylight, the research team identified extensive sets of parallel scratch marks preserved directly on the exposed limestone walls, positioned at heights and in patterns immediately suggestive of a large, climbing or clawing animal, rather than any known geological weathering process. Careful measurement of the marks themselves proved decisive. The spacing between adjacent claw marks, the specific curvature of each individual scratch, and the estimated size of the digit responsible for producing them all matched, with striking precision, the reconstructed claw dimensions already established from Thylacoleo skeletal material recovered from separate sites decades earlier. No other known Pleistocene Australian animal possessed claws of the correct size, shape, and spacing to have produced this specific pattern. The marks were not simply consistent with Thylacoleo. They were, for all practical scientific purposes, a direct signature, as individually identifiable in their own way as a fingerprint. What makes this discovery particularly valuable is what it reveals about Thylacoleo's behaviour beyond simple predation. The marks were concentrated specifically around narrow passages and constricted sections of the cave system, precisely the kind of location a large animal might use repeatedly for controlled access and egress, rather than the kind of essentially random marking that might result from a single incidental encounter. This pattern strongly supports the interpretation that Thylacoleo used these specific caves repeatedly over an extended period, most likely as a denning site, a place to raise vulnerable young in a naturally defensible, predator-resistant environment sealed away from the more open, more dangerous territory Diprotodon, Procoptodon, and Megalania all shared on the surface above. This detail adds a genuinely interesting dimension to the picture this film has already built of Thylacoleo as a pure, mechanically optimized killing machine. An animal capable of generating this much raw biting force, equipped with dedicated disemboweling claws, was also, apparently, a creature that returned repeatedly to the same dark, enclosed spaces, navigating narrow passages with enough physical control and enough familiarity with the terrain to avoid leaving anything resembling random, undirected damage across the cave walls. The same claws capable of opening a Diprotodon's body cavity were also precise enough and controlled enough to be used repeatedly within the same tight stone corridors, without the kind of chaotic, uncoordinated scarring a less capable or less familiar animal might have left behind. Diprotodon, grazing placidly across the open grassland, and Thylacoleo, capable of generating this kind of specialized, concentrated force, represent two ends of the same evolutionary story. An herbivore whose sheer scale had made it a target too large for ordinary predation, met by a predator whose entire body plan had been refined into a single, devastatingly efficient solution to exactly that problem. But Thylacoleo was far from the only specialized killer this continent had assembled. If it represented raw, concentrated bite force, our next animal represents something closer to a repurposed weapon most people would never think to look for on a kangaroo. Procoptodon goliath stood up to 2 meters, about 6 feet 6 inches, tall, making it the largest kangaroo species ever documented, roughly double the height of the largest kangaroo species alive today. But height alone undersells how genuinely strange this animal actually was. Unlike modern kangaroos, which retain 4 functional toes on each hind foot, Procoptodon had reduced this down to a single enlarged toe on each foot, effectively converting its hind limbs into something resembling a horse's hoof. An adaptation that current biomechanical modeling suggests allowed for a longer, more efficient stride at speed across open terrain, at some cost to the more flexible, adjustable footing modern kangaroo species retain. Procoptodon's skull tells its own story. Its face was noticeably shortened and flattened compared to modern kangaroo species, with forward-facing eye sockets providing a degree of binocular vision unusual among grazing animals, but common among predators and animals requiring precise depth perception for a specific task. Combined with unusually long, robust forearms, ending in a pair of curved claws considerably larger and more substantial than anything modern kangaroos possess. Current research increasingly interprets Procoptodon not as a passive browser simply reaching for high vegetation, but as an animal potentially capable of using those forearms for genuinely forceful grappling, whether defensively against predators like Thylacoleo or in direct competition with other Procoptodon individuals. It is worth pausing, too, on the specific challenge Procoptodon's unusual single-toed foot presented to researchers attempting to reconstruct exactly how this animal actually moved. Modern kangaroos rely on a distinctive hopping gait, and the elastic tendons running through their hind legs store and release energy with each bound, making hopping at higher speeds considerably more energy efficient than a comparable running gait would be for an animal of similar size. Procoptodon's radically restructured foot, however, raised a genuine biomechanical question. Could an animal built this differently still hop in the conventional macropod sense, or had its anatomy shifted toward some other, less familiar form of locomotion entirely? A detailed biomechanical study published in 2014 modeled Procoptodon's likely gait directly, concluding that its unusual foot structure remained broadly consistent with hopping locomotion, though very likely at a somewhat reduced top speed compared to smaller, more anatomically conventional kangaroo species, trading some raw velocity for the structural stability its considerably greater body mass required. This is worth pausing on directly because it complicates the comfortable modern image of kangaroos as gentle grass eaters. Procoptodon Goliath, standing at head height with an adult human, equipped with forward-facing eyes and grappling forearms tipped with genuine claws, represents exactly the kind of animal that populated an Australian landscape already containing Diprotodon and Thylacoleo. Herbivores here were not simply large, they were increasingly well-armed. If the mammals of this continent had already reached this level of specialized danger, the reptiles occupying the same landscape pushed the entire equation considerably further. Megalania, formerly classified as Varanus priscus, holds the title of the largest terrestrial lizard confirmed anywhere in the fossil record. Size estimates have varied considerably across different research teams and methodologies, with earlier reconstructions suggesting lengths approaching 7 meters, over 23 feet, while more conservative recent analyses, based on more complete comparative skeletal material, place likely maximum lengths closer to 5 to 6 meters, roughly 16 to 20 feet, still dramatically larger than the modern Komodo dragon, its closest living relative at a maximum length of around 3 meters. Megalania's specific hunting strategy remains a subject of genuine ongoing scientific debate, and this film owes you honesty about exactly where that debate currently stands. Some researchers, drawing direct comparison to the modern Komodo dragon, which delivers a mildly venomous bite that works in combination with powerful bacterial infection to gradually weaken prey over subsequent days, have proposed Megalania may have employed a broadly similar strategy, and preliminary comparative studies of venom gland structure across the broader monitor lizard family lend some support to this possibility. Other researchers argue that an animal of Megalania's genuinely enormous size likely relied primarily on sheer physical strength, powerful jaws, and serrated, blade-like teeth to subdue prey directly, with any venom delivery serving at most a secondary or supplementary role rather than a primary killing mechanism. As of this film's production, no scientific consensus has definitively settled this specific question, and it remains one of the genuinely open frontiers in Australian megafauna research. What is not in dispute is Megalania's position at the very top of this continent's food web. An animal large enough to have plausibly preyed upon juvenile Diprotodon, and powerful enough that even adult Thylacoleo would have had genuine reason for caution. It is worth spending more time with Megalania's broader evolutionary context, because understanding exactly how this animal relates to its modern relatives helps clarify both how it likely hunted and why its exact size has proven so genuinely difficult to pin down. Megalania belongs to the genus Varanus, the same genus containing every living monitor lizard, including the Komodo dragon, currently the largest living lizard species on Earth, reaching lengths of up to 3 meters and weights approaching 70 kilograms in exceptional individuals. Genetic and anatomical analysis places Megalania as a close relative of the Komodo dragon and the closely related lace monitor, native to eastern Australia today, suggesting the broader Varanus lineage arrived in Australia sometime during the Miocene epoch, and subsequently underwent a dramatic increase in body size, tracking the same broader continental trend toward gigantism already documented among Australia's mammalian megafauna. The specific challenge in pinning down Megalania's maximum size traces directly back to the frustratingly incomplete nature of the fossil material recovered so far. Unlike Diprotodon or Thylacoleo, for which researchers have recovered multiple substantially complete skeletons, Megalania is known primarily from fragmentary vertebrae, isolated skull fragments, and scattered limb bones, none belonging to a single, fully articulated specimen. Earlier researchers, working from these fragments in the mid-20th century, extrapolated total body length using comparative scaling ratios drawn from complete modern monitor lizard skeletons, an approach that produced the frequently cited estimate of up to 7 meters. More recent analysis, incorporating a broader comparative dataset and more sophisticated statistical scaling methods, has generally favored a somewhat more conservative maximum length, though even these revised figures leave Megalania comfortably the largest terrestrial lizard confirmed anywhere in the fossil record, dwarfing every living relative by a considerable margin. The venom question deserves slightly more technical attention as well, because the underlying science connects directly to a genuinely significant discovery about monitor lizards, made only in the past 2 decades. For most of the 20th century, the severe infections frequently following a Komodo dragon bite were attributed entirely to virulent bacteria accumulating in the animal's mouth from decomposing meat. Research published in 2009, however, identified functional venom glands within the Komodo dragon's lower jaw, producing a cocktail of compounds capable of inducing shock, preventing blood clotting, and causing a rapid drop in blood pressure in bitten prey. A genuine venom delivery system operating alongside, rather than instead of, the bacterial infection previously assumed to be the primary mechanism. This relatively recent discovery fundamentally reshaped scientific understanding of how monitor lizards as a broader group actually subdue prey, and it directly informs the ongoing debate about Megalania already introduced earlier in this film. Since an animal this closely related to the Komodo dragon inherited, at minimum, the same basic anatomical starting point from which venom delivery could plausibly have evolved to an even greater degree in a considerably larger predator. What can be said with confidence, regardless of how the venom question is eventually resolved, is that Megalania represents the most extreme expression of a lineage already well adapted for exactly this kind of ecological role, arriving in Australia as a moderately sized monitor lizard and departing the fossil record tens of millions of years later as the largest terrestrial lizard this planet has ever confirmed. Sharing this same landscape and representing a genuinely unusual evolutionary experiment in its own right was Quincana, a genus of terrestrial crocodile reaching lengths of up to 3 meters, about 10 feet. This detail deserves emphasis because it directly contradicts the mental image most people carry of crocodiles as ambush predators lying motionless in water. Quincana's limbs were proportionally longer and more upright than those of any modern crocodile species, positioned more directly beneath the body rather than sprawled out to the sides. An anatomical arrangement that current biomechanical analysis suggests would have allowed for considerably more efficient, sustained movement across dry land. Some researchers have gone so far as to describe Quincana's limb structure as approaching a semi-hoofed or semi-ungulate configuration, a genuinely strange convergence for an animal belonging to the crocodilian lineage. Quincana's teeth further reinforce this picture of an animal built for active land-based hunting rather than aquatic ambush. Rather than the simple, uniform, conical teeth typical of modern crocodiles, adapted primarily for gripping slippery prey underwater, Quincana possessed laterally compressed serrated teeth, structurally similar in basic function to the teeth of many predatory dinosaurs, well suited to slicing through flesh rather than simply gripping and holding. An animal built like this, moving actively across open terrain rather than waiting motionless in a river, represents one of the more genuinely unexpected entries in this continent's already unusual predator lineup. Rounding out this continent's already formidable predator lineup was one final specialized hunter this film has not yet introduced: an animal belonging to a group most people assume disappeared from the fossil record considerably earlier than it actually did. Warnambi narracortensis, a genuinely massive constricting snake, reaching lengths estimated at up to 6 meters, roughly 20 feet, and belonging to an ancient lineage called the Madsoids, a group of primitive snakes that had otherwise vanished from most of the rest of the world tens of millions of years earlier, persisting in isolated Australia long after going extinct everywhere else. Unlike modern constricting snakes such as pythons, which kill through sustained muscular constriction that gradually cuts off a prey animal's blood circulation, current biomechanical analysis of Warnambi's unusually rigid vertebral column suggests it may have relied on a somewhat different strategy, using its considerable body mass and strength to physically crush and immobilize prey through raw pinning force, rather than the more gradual, patient constriction modern pythons employ. Fossil remains recovered from Narracorta caves in South Australia, a site so rich in Pleistocene fossil material It has since been recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site specifically for its megafauna preservation. Place Wanambi within the same broad predator guild already discussed extensively throughout this film, sharing territory with Thylacoleo, Megalania, and Quincana in what was evidently a genuinely competitive, multi-layered ecosystem, rather than any single dominant predator enjoying uncontested access to the continent's abundant, well-defended prey. This detail matters for properly understanding the full picture this film has been building. Diprotodon, Procoptodon, Genyornis, and the other large herbivores already introduced were not simply threatened by one exceptional predator. They existed within a landscape containing, simultaneously, a mammalian predator with the strongest relative bite force ever confirmed in any carnivorous mammal, a reptilian predator potentially exceeding 5 meters and possibly venomous, a terrestrial crocodile built for sustained pursuit across dry land, and a 6-meter constricting snake descended from a lineage extinct everywhere else on the planet. 4 entirely different evolutionary solutions to the same basic predatory problem, operating simultaneously within the same relatively confined ecological space. Narakuorte Caves itself deserves brief mention as a site in its own right, because the specific preservation conditions there, a series of vertical shaft entrances that periodically trapped animals falling in from the surface above, unable to climb back out, has produced one of the most complete records of Pleistocene Australian megafauna found anywhere on the continent, preserving remains across a continuous span of roughly 500,000 years and offering researchers an unusually detailed window into exactly how this entire predator and prey community shifted, species by species, across the final chapters of Australia's megafauna era before the broader continental extinction pattern already discussed brought this remarkable ecological arrangement to its eventual, still not fully understood conclusion. Diprotodon was not the only large, strange herbivore sharing this landscape, and one of its lesser-known contemporaries offers a genuinely remarkable illustration of just how difficult it can be to accurately reconstruct an animal known only from fragmentary remains. Paleontology azael, a marsupial roughly the size of a modern horse, presents one of the more genuinely puzzling anatomical profiles in the entire Australian megafauna record. Its skull features a distinctive retracted nasal opening, positioned unusually high and far back, a structural feature that in living mammals is almost always associated with the presence of a flexible, muscular trunk, similar in basic concept to the trunk of a modern tapir or elephant, though almost certainly considerably shorter and stockier given Paleontology's overall build. Combined with unusually powerful forelimbs and large curved claws, this evidence has led most current researchers to reconstruct Paleontology as a specialized browser, likely using its clawed forelimbs to pull down branches or strip bark from trees, while its short trunk assisted in gathering vegetation, a genuinely unusual feeding strategy with no close parallel among Australia's other megafauna. The history of how scientists arrived at this current understanding offers a genuinely instructive and slightly embarrassing case study in the difficulty of paleontological reconstruction from incomplete material. For decades following its initial description, Palaeocestus was classified as an unusually large species of kangaroo, based primarily on early fragmentary jaw material that seemed broadly consistent with known macropod anatomy. Working from this assumption, the Australian Museum in Sydney constructed a full-scale physical reconstruction of the animal, standing roughly 3 meters tall, depicting an enormous, bizarre kangaroo-like creature intended for public display. When more complete skull material was subsequently recovered and carefully re-examined in 1958, researcher Jim Woods realized the animal actually lacked the specific dental and skeletal features that define true kangaroos entirely, and instead showed clear affinities with an entirely different marsupial lineage related to Diprotodon. The museum's existing 3-meter reconstruction, built confidently around a fundamentally incorrect identification, was subsequently destroyed rather than displayed alongside the corrected scientific understanding, reportedly to avoid the ongoing public embarrassment of a prominent, expensive exhibit built on a mistaken foundation. This episode serves as a genuinely useful reminder, worth carrying forward through the remainder of this film. Every reconstruction presented across this entire program, however confident it may appear, represents current best scientific understanding built from the physical evidence available today, not a permanently settled, unchangeable fact. Science corrects itself, sometimes dramatically, when better evidence eventually arrives. Zygomaturus trilobus, a close relative of Diprotodon within the same broader family, presents a somewhat better documented but no less unusual profile. A heavily built herbivore, roughly the size of a large ox, distinguished by prominent, laterally flared cheekbones that gave its skull a genuinely distinctive, almost helmeted appearance, likely serving as an attachment point for powerful jaw muscles suited to processing tough, fibrous vegetation. Fossil trackway evidence recovered from several Australian sites indicates Zygomaturus favored wetland and swamp margin habitats specifically, a preference that may have offered some degree of protection from Thylacoleo and other primarily terrestrial predators, though certainly not complete safety, given Quincana's well-documented comfort moving across exactly this kind of semi-aquatic terrain. Rounding out this ecosystem was Genyornis newtoni, a flightless bird standing roughly 2 meters, about 6 feet 6 inches, tall and weighing an estimated 240 kilograms, roughly 530 pounds, making it one of the largest birds documented anywhere in the fossil record. Genyornis's specific diet remains debated, with evidence pointing toward a herbivorous or possibly omnivorous lifestyle, rather than active predation. But its sheer scale meant that, even as prey rather than predator, it represented a genuinely formidable presence within this ecosystem, its powerful legs capable of delivering a defensive kick with real force behind it. Taken together, Diprotodon, Thylacoleo, Procoptodon, Megalania, Quincana, and Genyornis represent only a portion of the full Pleistocene Australian megafauna assemblage, but they illustrate the core pattern this film has been building toward. A continent where isolation did not simply produce large versions of familiar animals, but genuinely different solutions to the basic biological problems every ecosystem must solve, arrived at independently through tens of millions of years with essentially no outside biological input. There is one final, genuinely fascinating body of evidence worth examining before this film turns to the broader question of extinction, because it touches on something this film has not yet addressed directly: the possibility that humans and this continent's megafauna coexisted and were directly observed by the same eyes for considerably longer than the fossil dates alone might suggest. Scattered across rock shelters in Arnhem Land, the Kimberley region, and several other locations across northern Australia, researchers have documented numerous rock art paintings depicting large, unfamiliar animals that bear little resemblance to anything living on the continent today. One particularly striking example, photographed in Deaf Adder Gorge in western Arnhem Land, shows a large quadruped with muscular limbs, prominent claws, a long, narrowing face, and two distinctive tufts of hair or similar material hanging from its chest, accompanied by a smaller figure of apparently the same species positioned nearby, plausibly interpreted as a juvenile. Researchers examining this specific painting have proposed it depicts Paleontology, the trunk-bearing browser already discussed. Its overall proportions and specific anatomical details bearing a genuine resemblance to current scientific reconstructions of that animal. Other rock art sites across northern Australia have been tentatively identified as potentially depicting Genyornis, the giant flightless bird already introduced earlier in this film, and, in at least two documented cases from Arnhem Land, animals researchers have proposed may represent Thylacoleo itself, based on distinctive body proportions, and in one image, what appears to be a prominent tufted tail unlike anything found among the continent's surviving fauna. It is important, in the interest of full scientific honesty, to note directly that these specific identifications remain genuinely contested within the research community. Rock art researcher Robert Bednarik has published detailed critiques arguing that none of the proposed megafauna identifications hold up under close scrutiny, pointing to the inherent difficulty of confidently identifying a specific extinct species from a stylized painted image. The near total absence of reliable direct dating for most rock art of this kind, and the significant degradation many of these paintings have suffered from weathering, water damage, and centuries of natural exposure. Other researchers, while acknowledging these genuine limitations, maintain that the specific combination of anatomical details preserved in several of these paintings is difficult to fully explain through alternative interpretations, and that the paintings deserve serious consideration as at least plausible depictions of animals their creators may have genuinely observed. Separate from the rock art evidence entirely, oral traditions maintained by several Aboriginal groups, including specific accounts from the Tiapvurung people of southern Australia describing a large flightless bird whose head reached as high as the hills, alongside detailed traditional accounts of specific hunting techniques used against this bird, add a further layer of genuinely intriguing, if similarly difficult to definitively date. potential evidence for direct, sustained human familiarity with animals closely resembling Genyornis. Whether or not any specific rock art image or oral account can be confidently confirmed as depicting a genuine, scientifically documented megafauna species, this broader body of evidence serves as a valuable reminder that the story this film has been tracing was never purely a matter of bones and sediment cores. Real people, the ancestors of Australia's Aboriginal communities today, very plausibly stood face to face with at least some of these animals, watched them, hunted them, and, if these contested but genuinely compelling artistic traditions are eventually confirmed, chose to preserve their memory in stone. Every one of these animals, without exception, is now extinct. And the question of exactly why remains one of the most actively contested debates in the entire field of Australian paleontology. It is worth pausing on exactly what human arrival in Australia actually required, because the achievement itself deserves genuine attention, and because understanding it helps explain why the newcomers who eventually encountered Diprotodon, Thylacoleo, and the rest of this continent's remarkable fauna were never simply wandering in by accident. Even at the height of the last glacial period, when global sea levels sat considerably lower than today, and land bridges connected many regions now separated by open water, Australia remained isolated by a substantial stretch of open ocean from the nearest landmasses to its north. A barrier researchers estimate would have required a minimum sea crossing of roughly 90 kilometers, and quite possibly considerably further, depending on the specific route taken and the precise sea levels prevailing at the time of the crossing. This was not a narrow channel a determined swimmer or a simple raft might cross by chance. It required genuine, deliberate maritime capability, constructed watercraft, sufficient navigational awareness, or extraordinary fortune to locate land invisible from the point of departure, and enough people, resources, and reproductive success among the initial arrivals to establish a viable, lasting population on the other side. This makes the peopling of Australia one of the earliest confirmed instances of genuine open ocean voyaging, documented anywhere in human history, predating comparable seafaring achievements elsewhere in the world by tens of thousands of years. Whoever those first arrivals were, they were not passively drifting into a new landscape. They were the products of a population already possessing sophisticated boat-building knowledge, coordinated planning, and the kind of collective courage required to deliberately set out across open water toward a destination that, for at least some portion of the journey, could not have been visible from the point of departure at all. What awaited them once they arrived was a continent unlike anything their ancestors, wherever precisely they had originated, had previously encountered. Unfamiliar plants, unfamiliar terrain, and, populating that terrain, an entirely unfamiliar catalogue of animals shaped by tens of millions of years of isolated evolution already discussed at length throughout this film. There would have been no accumulated ancestral knowledge, no inherited cultural memory of how to safely approach an animal like Thylacoleo or Megalania, no prior experience anywhere in human history to draw upon when encountering a marsupial predator with a bite force exceeding a lion's, or a lizard several times the length of any human being. Every single piece of practical, survivable knowledge about this continent's genuinely formidable wildlife had to be developed directly through careful observation, trial, and, quite plausibly, tragic error by the very first generations to set foot on Australian soil. This context matters directly for properly weighing the broader extinction debate already discussed throughout this film. Whatever specific role human hunting, deliberate landscape burning, or simple ecological disruption ultimately played in the slow decline of Australia's megafauna, that role was played by a population arriving with no prior template for managing this specific ecosystem, encountering, for the first time in the entire history of their species, precisely the kind of continent that tens of millions of years of uninterrupted isolation had quietly assembled. The timeline itself is reasonably well established. Modern humans first arrived on the Australian continent by boat somewhere in the range of 65,000 years ago, and the overwhelming majority of the continent's largest animals, including every species discussed in this film, had disappeared from the fossil record by approximately 40,000 years ago. A landmark 2017 study published in Nature Communications, led by researcher Sander van der Kaas, and drawing on a detailed sediment core recovered from off the southwestern coast, used fossilized fungal spores associated specifically with the dung of large herbivores to track megafauna population density directly through the sediment record. Their finding: megafauna populations underwent a sharp, unmistakable collapse. Within roughly 2,000 years of the estimated timing of human arrival in the surrounding region, a genuinely rapid decline on a geological timescale, and one that, on its face, points fairly directly toward human involvement as a significant contributing factor. But an honest account of this debate requires resisting the temptation to declare the question definitively settled. A comprehensive review published in November of 2024 characterized the broader scientific picture in genuinely careful terms. While researchers largely agree the decline was not a single sudden catastrophic event, but rather occurred gradually across a window spanning roughly 10,000 years, considerable disagreement remains regarding the relative weight of the specific contributing causes. Three broad positions currently coexist within the field: a primarily climate-driven explanation, pointing to the dramatic aridification of the Australian interior occurring across this same general period; a primarily human-driven explanation, emphasizing hunting pressure, habitat modification through deliberate landscape burning, and disruption of existing ecological relationships; and a combined explanation, proposing that neither factor alone fully accounts for the pattern, and that human arrival likely acted as an additional compounding stress on populations already under genuine pressure from a drying, increasingly unpredictable climate. The specific question of direct human predation on Australian megafauna, humans actively hunting and butchering these animals, as opposed to more indirect effects like habitat disruption, has proven particularly difficult to confirm using hard physical evidence. And a study published in October of 2025 in Royal Society Open Science illustrates exactly why. The study's authors revisited what had long been considered the single strongest piece of direct physical evidence for human butchering of Australian megafauna. A cut-marked tibia bone recovered decades earlier from Mammoth Cave in southwestern Western Australia, originally interpreted as bearing clear evidence of deliberate human tool marks. Using modern microcomputed tomography scanning and detailed microscopic surface texture analysis, considerably more precise than the techniques available at the time of the bone's original examination, the research team re-examined this specimen directly. Their conclusion: even this single, long-sighted piece of putative direct evidence requires further, more rigorous testing before it can be confidently confirmed as genuine evidence of human butchering rather than damage produced through some other, entirely natural process. One further piece of contested evidence deserves direct attention within this broader extinction debate, because it connects directly back to Genyornis, and because the specific back and forth surrounding it illustrates just how genuinely difficult it remains to establish confident, direct proof of human predation on Australian megafauna, even when the underlying physical evidence initially appears remarkably compelling. In 2016, a research team led by geochronologist Gifford Miller published findings in Nature Communications describing what they characterized as the first secure, direct evidence of human predation on Australian megafauna. Burned fragments of Genyornis eggshell, recovered from more than 200 separate sites scattered across the continent, primarily within ancient coastal sand dunes where the birds had once nested. Careful chemical analysis of the burn patterns preserved on these shell fragments, specifically examining how heat had altered the amino acids within the shell material, revealed a thermal gradient the research team argued as consistent with an egg having been placed directly on a small ember fire. Exactly the kind of low-controlled heat a human cooking an egg for food might produce, as distinct from the pattern a large, uncontrolled bushfire would typically leave behind. Dating placed these specific burned fragments within a window between roughly 54,000 and 43,000 years ago, overlapping closely with the currently accepted timeline for initial human arrival on the continent. The proposed mechanism carried genuine ecological weight beyond the individual eggs themselves. Systematically harvesting eggs rather than hunting adult birds directly would have reduced Genyornis reproductive success considerably more efficiently than predation on adults alone, since a single collected clutch represents an entire generation of potential offspring removed in one action. A genuinely plausible pathway toward gradual, sustained population decline, operating quietly across many centuries, well before any dramatic, easily documented single hunting event. This finding did not go unchallenged, and the resulting scientific exchange remains genuinely active as of this film's production. Critics have specifically questioned the eggshell identification underlying the entire argument, proposing that at least some of the burned fragments originally attributed to Genyornis may instead belong to a considerably smaller, unrelated bird species, an identification error that, if correct, would substantially undermine the case for direct human predation on Genyornis specifically. A more recent review, published in 2025, revisited this question directly, alongside several other previously proposed pieces of direct evidence for human megafauna predation across Australia, including the mammoth cave tibia already discussed earlier in this film, and argued that the broader body of evidence for direct, confirmed human hunting of Australian megafauna remains considerably less secure than earlier confident announcements had suggested. There is one further, genuinely important mechanism worth examining directly within this broader extinction debate, because it addresses a specific pathway through which human presence could have reshaped this continent's ecosystem considerably more thoroughly than direct hunting alone. Even without a single spear ever being thrown at a diprotodon or a genyornis, Aboriginal Australians developed and continue practicing today a sophisticated land management technique commonly referred to as fire stick farming, involving the deliberate, carefully patterned burning of vegetation across the landscape at specific times and in specific locations. A practice that fundamentally reshapes plant community composition over sustained use, favoring fire-adapted, quick regenerating vegetation over the slower-growing, more fire-vulnerable plant communities that may have previously dominated large sections of the continent. This practice, well documented in the historical and ethnographic record, across numerous Aboriginal groups and increasingly supported by paleoecological evidence extending back tens of thousands of years, represents a genuinely different category of human environmental impact than direct predation, operating gradually, cumulatively, across the underlying vegetation structure of an entire ecosystem, rather than through the more immediately visible mechanism of hunting individual animals. The specific ecological consequence most relevant to this film's central subject involves exactly the kind of large, specialized herbivores already discussed at length. Animals like Diprotodon, Zygomaturus, and Palorchestes, each adapted across millions of years to specific, often comparatively slow-growing vegetation types that sustained fire stick burning, practiced consistently across enough generations, would have gradually reduced in overall availability across the landscape. An herbivore population already under genuine climatic pressure from a continent growing steadily drier. As already documented directly through the Lake Callabonna evidence discussed earlier in this film, facing simultaneous compounding pressure from a shifting vegetation baseline reshaped by deliberate human fire management, would have confronted a genuinely difficult combination of stresses, neither one alone necessarily catastrophic, but potentially devastating when operating together across the same already vulnerable populations. This mechanism offers researchers a genuinely compelling middle path between the two more extreme positions this film has already outlined: the purely climate-driven explanation and the purely hunting-driven explanation. Fire stick farming does not require imagining coordinated, systematic hunting campaigns deliberately targeting specific megafauna species to extinction. It requires only the ordinary, well-documented practice of a newly arrived population managing its landscape according to established, effective techniques applied consistently across many centuries, interacting with an already stressed, already declining megafauna population in a way that, cumulatively, may have tipped multiple already struggling species past the point of sustainable recovery. It is worth stating plainly that this specific mechanism, like nearly every other piece of evidence already discussed throughout this film's examination of Australia's extinction debate, remains an active area of genuine scientific investigation rather than a fully settled conclusion. Researchers continue working to establish more precise chronologies, connecting specific documented shifts in fossil pollen and charcoal records to the specific population trajectories of individual megafauna species, work that will likely continue refining and quite possibly revising the current scientific understanding for years to come. What can be said with confidence is that the true explanation for what happened to Diprotodon, Thylacoleo, and the rest of this continent's extraordinary Pleistocene fauna was very likely never a single simple story at all, but a genuinely complex convergence of a changing climate and a genuinely novel ecological force, human presence, interacting across many centuries in ways this film's most current available science is still working to fully untangle. This specific dispute, considered alongside the Mammoth Cave reanalysis already introduced earlier in this film, reinforces a pattern worth stating plainly. The broad, timeline-based case connecting human arrival to Australian megafauna decline remains genuinely strong, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same general conclusion. But the specific individual pieces of proposed direct physical evidence, the smoking gun evidence a popular audience might reasonably expect for a story this dramatic, have proven again and again, upon closer and more rigorous re-examination, to require considerably more caution than their initial announcements implied. This finding matters enormously for understanding where this debate genuinely stands today, heading into the second half of this decade. It is not that scientists doubt humans played some meaningful role in the broader pattern of Australian megafauna extinction. The timeline correlation alone, established across multiple independent lines of evidence, makes a purely coincidental relationship increasingly difficult to sustain. It is that the specific, direct, physical evidence connecting human hunting activity to individual animal deaths remains considerably harder to establish with full scientific confidence than popular accounts of this extinction event often suggest. And researchers working in this specific corner of paleontology continue actively revisiting, retesting, and in some cases directly challenging evidence that had been treated as settled for decades. What ultimately killed Diprotodon, Thylacoleo, Procoptodon, Megalania, Quincana, and Genyornis was very likely not one single, clean, easily identified cause, but some genuinely complex combination of a rapidly drying continent and a newly arrived species uniquely capable of reshaping the landscape around it. Through hunting, through fire, through the simple accumulated pressure of a new apex competitor entering an ecosystem that had spent tens of millions of years evolving without one. What remains, tens of thousands of years later, is a fossil record describing a continent that genuinely does deserve its reputation, not through exaggeration, but through sober, carefully measured scientific fact. A predator with the strongest relative bite force of any confirmed mammalian carnivore. A kangaroo built for grappling rather than grazing alone. A lizard longer than most modern cars. A crocodile that had, in a genuine sense, forgotten how to be a crocodile, choosing instead to hunt across dry, open land on legs built for sustained pursuit. Prehistoric Australia was not dangerous because storytellers needed it to be. It was dangerous because an entire continent, left alone for tens of millions of years, had quietly built exactly the kind of world that isolation, given enough time, was always going to produce. There is a final thread worth drawing out before this film closes, because it connects the extraordinary animals already discussed directly to the considerably more familiar wildlife sharing the Australian continent today. And it reframes the entire preceding narrative in a way genuinely worth sitting with. Every animal introduced across this film belongs to a lineage that, in a meaningfully reduced but genuinely unbroken form, persists in Australia today. The modern common wombat, rarely exceeding 35 kilograms, remains Diprotodon's closest surviving relative, sharing the same basic dental architecture and the same fundamental marsupial reproductive strategy, scaled down by a factor of roughly 80 across tens of thousands of years of post-extinction adaptation to a continent that could no longer reliably support anything approaching its ancestors' original bulk. The modern lace monitor and the introduced but closely related Komodo dragon carry forward the same basic Varanus body plan that produced Megalania, considerably reduced in scale but recognizably built from the identical evolutionary blueprint. Even the eastern grey kangaroo, grazing peacefully across suburban golf courses and open paddocks throughout much of modern Australia, descends from the same broader macropod lineage that once produced Procoptodon's grappling forearms and forward-facing eyes. This continuity matters because it complicates any simple narrative in which Pleistocene Australia represents some entirely separate, vanished world, disconnected from the continent recognized today. It was not a separate world. It was this same world, populated by considerably larger, considerably more heavily armed versions of animals whose direct descendants still graze, burrow, and bask across the same landscape their ancestors once dominated at a genuinely different scale. The wombat digging a burrow in a modern Australian backyard carries, quite literally, the same basic genetic inheritance that once built an animal the size of a small car. The scale changed. The underlying evolutionary blueprint, refined across tens of millions of years of continental isolation, did not. This kind of detailed biomechanical reconstruction, applied consistently across every animal this film has introduced, illustrates something worth stating directly before this film's closing thoughts. Modern paleontology rarely operates through simple guesswork or artistic license. Each specific claim about how Thylacoleo bit, how Quincana walked, or how Procoptodon moved rests on a foundation of careful comparative anatomy, physical testing, and, increasingly, sophisticated computer modeling capable of simulating muscle attachment points, joint mechanics, and load-bearing capacity directly from preserved skeletal material. The genuinely strange, genuinely formidable Australia this film has described is not the product of speculation stretched to fill a dramatic narrative. It is the product of exactly this kind of patient, methodical scientific reconstruction applied consistently across decades of accumulated research and, as this film has shown repeatedly, continuously revised and refined as new evidence and new analytical techniques become available. One final, genuinely current piece of research deserves mention before this film draws to a close, because it illustrates that the scientific investigation of this remarkable lost fauna remains very much an active, ongoing pursuit rather than a settled chapter of paleontological history. Traditional ancient DNA extraction, the technique that has revolutionized understanding of extinct animals ranging from woolly mammoths to Ice Age humans, has proven frustratingly difficult to apply to Australian megafauna specimens, largely because the continent's warm climate degrades genetic material considerably faster than the cold, stable conditions found in locations like Siberian permafrost, where the best preserved ancient DNA specimens are typically recovered. This limitation has left considerable uncertainty surrounding the precise evolutionary relationships connecting some of Australia's extinct megafauna to their closest surviving relatives. Questions traditional skeletal comparison alone cannot always fully resolve. Research published in 2025 offers a promising alternative approach: collagen fingerprinting, a technique that examines the specific structure of collagen protein, considerably more chemically stable and more likely to survive degradation than genetic material preserved within fossil bone. By comparing subtle variations in collagen structure across multiple extinct and living species, researchers can reconstruct evolutionary relationships even in cases where the underlying DNA has degraded beyond useful recovery, offering a genuinely valuable second pathway toward answering questions ancient DNA analysis alone cannot address in Australia's specific climatic conditions. This technique has already begun refining understanding of exactly how closely related several of the animals discussed throughout this film actually are to one another and to their modern surviving relatives, work that continues actively as this film is being produced. This detail matters as a closing note because it reinforces something this film has returned to repeatedly. Every specific claim presented throughout this program, however confidently stated, represents the current best understanding available from currently accessible evidence and currently available analytical technique, not a permanently fixed, unchangeable truth. Paleontology was once confidently reconstructed as a giant kangaroo, until better evidence proved otherwise. The mammoth cave tibia was once considered secure proof of human butchering, until modern scanning technology demanded a more cautious reassessment. The Genyornis eggshell evidence was once presented as definitive proof of human predation, until subsequent researchers raised genuine questions about species identification. Science investigating this remarkable, genuinely dangerous lost world continues actively today, and the picture this film has presented will very likely continue sharpening and, in places, shifting as researchers keep asking better questions of the physical evidence this extraordinary continent has left behind. Consider, finally, the sheer scale of what tens of millions of years of isolation actually produced on this single continent. A marsupial predator with the strongest confirmed relative bite force of any mammalian carnivore on the planet. An herbivore large enough to require its own dedicated apex predator. A kangaroo built for grappling rather than simple grazing. A lizard longer than most family cars. A crocodile that had abandoned water for open land. A constricting snake surviving tens of millions of years after its closest relatives vanished everywhere else on Earth. And a flightless bird standing taller than most adult humans. No other continent, anywhere on the planet, produced quite this specific combination, because no other continent spent quite this long entirely alone. This is, ultimately, the deeper significance behind everything this film has traced. Not simply a catalogue of impressive extinct animals, genuinely remarkable as each one was, but a demonstration of exactly what evolution is capable of producing when given sufficient time, sufficient isolation, and a continent's worth of raw biological material to work with, unconstrained by competition from outside lineages that, on every other continent, arrived far earlier and closed off many of the same evolutionary pathways before they could be fully explored. Australia's isolation was not simply a geographic curiosity. It was a genuinely unique natural experiment, run continuously for tens of millions of years. And the animals this film has introduced represent some of its most extraordinary, most thoroughly documented results. Prehistoric Australia earned its reputation honestly through patient, careful science rather than exaggeration. And in a very real sense, it has never fully ended. The same evolutionary forces that built Thylacoleo's bite, Megalania's size, and Procoptodon's grappling forearms continue operating today on the same isolated continent, on the same surviving lineages, however much smaller and however much less immediately alarming their current descendants happen to be.